Good afternoon. My name is Maureen Lemassney, and I want to welcome you to this meeting of the Police Reform Work Group. I welcome not only our members, but also the public who are watching these proceedings. If you're joining us for the first time, our mission is to provide our County Executive, Angela Alsobrooks, with substantive recommendations that will establish fair practices across the board, maximize transparency, and restore public trust in law enforcement. The work group was not created to decide the merits of any pending or potential litigation, nor will the work group make any factual determinations in regard to any lawsuits or controversies. The work group was created to make recommendations regarding the policies of the Prince George's County Police Department, and not to resolve, discuss, or comment upon any specific or alleged events. These policies include recruitment and retention, financial management, independent oversight, and internal policies. We've established 5 subcommittees to make recommendations in these areas. These recommendations are due on December 4th, 2020. Our agenda tonight includes presentations by Dr. Tyrone Powers and Ms. Christina Roth. Delegate Washington.
Thank you, Judge, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alonzo Washington, State Delegate for District 22 here in Prince George's County, and I also am the co-chair of this work group. We have now been meeting as a work group weekly for the past several months to develop innovative structural reforms to our county's police department. We have held presentations and discussions on training, hiring practices, employee retention, citizens' complaints, the police budget, mental health, and much more. Tonight, we will have the opportunity to discuss the crucial issue of police use of force. Between 2015 and 2020, there have been 80 Maryland residents who were shot and killed by police in this state. Included in these are the tragic shootings and murders of William Green and Leonard Shand, and several others here in Prince George's County. Our state is also one of just a handful of US states that does not have a use of force standard in law. We will be hearing from some use of force professionals on the current policies that govern policing in our jurisdiction, as well as discuss steps we can take to address these issues. I'm excited by the opportunity that we have here tonight and look forward to an excellent discussion. Before we have our first speaker, I'm gonna ask our illustrious State's Attorney Aisha Brayboy to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Delegate Washington, and it's great to see you and your co-chair, Judge Lemassney. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be before you again. This work group is doing some amazing work, and I'm really excited to see your final work product. Tonight, I'm grateful that you've asked the use of force expert that has been working with the State's Attorney's Office to present. Dr. Tyrone Powers is really world-renowned. He's certainly known throughout the country as a use of force expert. He has testified on both sides for state and law enforcement agencies, as well as primarily for plaintiffs in civil suits dealing with use of force. So this is someone who is not biased in any way. He's very neutral, very well respected. Now he does come with a thick Baltimore accent, so I don't want you all to hold that against him. He's a great guy, and but he knows what he's talking about. He has been certified in our courts in Prince George's County, as well as courts throughout the state of Maryland and around the country as a use of force expert. We have, our office has decided to really use folks like him when we are looking at very serious use of force cases in our county. We think it's important to have an independent expert. We know that the police department does great work, but we also live in an era where citizens want transparency, accountability, and they also want review. And so we understand that. We understand our role as the State's Attorney's Office to do justice and to do it in a way that is transparent and fair and recognizes the interests of our residents. So we are really excited that he'll be presenting before you today, and I'll turn it over now to Dr. Tyrone Powers.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to address this group. I'm glad we're looking at some reform and making things better in policing in general across the nation, but specifically in Prince George's County. And I've had the opportunity to work with the state's attorney and others in the county and look at some cases already. So, and I know we have a very brief period of time tonight, so I'm not going to do kind of like my full presentation on this, even though I think it's important, and I think the recommendations are important. And the other thing I think about the recommendations that are important is that we don't have the luxury of time, because at any particular time, police could find themselves in a situation where they have to make a decision as to what type of force they should use. So I'm glad this committee is doing its work. I just, as I always recommend and suggest, that in some cases and with some recommendations and some policies, that it be expedited so that we can begin to address these issues almost immediately. Because again, we don't know what night they're going to take place or how they're going to take place. I've done several briefings on the Hyattsville shooting, and I like to kind of use that as an example only because it demonstrates a number of things with use of force, and then I developed some recommendations out of that, but can be applied to many other cases. In that case, and I'll start with the conclusion and work back, I concluded after reviewing numerous documents, after reviewing the video frame by frame, that the force used in that case was justified, consistent with the Supreme Court case of Garner versus Graham, which essentially says that the decision on what type of force an officer use, or whether they're able to use deadly force to stop the threat of deadly harm to them or serious bodily injury to them or someone else, that this particular case with the officers discharging their weapons met that standard, because at the time that it occurred, whatever precipitated that, and we'll talk a little bit about that, Mr. Shan was charging towards the officer with knives. And at that time, the officers don't really have the time to decide what made him run towards them. At that time, they're defending and protecting their life. And for the officers who are not in the direct path of Mr. Shan, they're protecting the lives of others. So from that clear stated standpoint, but there was some issues with that case. I won't go over all of them tonight. Obviously, the use of a flashbang, which leads to some of the recommendation. The flashbang grenade was used by a member of the Hyattsville Police Department. There was a number of agencies on that scene. Prince George's County, most of the officers were from Hyattsville. There were officers from Mount Rainier, a number of officers on the scene. Initially, when I began to review the videotape presentation and I watched it and I saw the flashbang go off and I saw Mr. Shan charge towards the officer, without going frame by frame and slowing it down, it looked as if the flashbang had caused him to run towards the officers with the knife. But it was a long standoff. And in reality, what occurred immediately prior to that is that someone deployed a shotgun beanbag, which was deployed towards Mr. Shan. And Mr. Shan had just said before it was deployed, if you deploy that, if you should be with that, I'm going to charge you. You could actually hear that on the presentation. So that was deployed. He began to move towards the officers, and at the time he began to move towards the officers, then a flashbang grenade was set off. The flashbang grenade, I think, from my expertise and looking at these cases all across the country, is extremely problematic. I made some specific recommendations about that. I don't know why that was used in an outside environment, but it should not have the effect of maybe disorienting the officers. I know what its intent is when it's properly used. But in this particular case, it was problematic. So already we look at recommendations in the report. And again, I don't have the time to go over all of it, but the recommendations in the report of even addressing that issue and addressing it forthrightly, addressing it quickly, the use of a flashbang grenade in that particular situation. Just to add a little bit to that, though, even with that, hypothetically speaking, let's say that for whatever reason, let's say it had, which is not true, if you look at the presentation, caused Mr. Shan to run towards the officers. The officers that fired the shot are still in their right to defend their life from deadly bodily harm or from serious bodily injury, because no matter what caused him to come towards them to knives, there's nothing that requires them to allow themselves to be stabbed. And that meets the objectionable reasonableness standard. that is required in the law. And as I've demonstrated or have I spoken to different groups, that would have been reasonable even if they weren't police officers. If for whatever reason someone charges towards you with a knife, you really don't have time to discern why they're coming towards you. If you're in a position to defend yourself, then you could defend yourself. I want to make that as plain as possible. However, from a policing standpoint, the standard is what's objectionably reasonable. And in this case, that was reasonable. I just want to clarify something though, and I think as you all begin to look at policy and changes and reform, objectionably reasonable, there's a lot in that terminology. For example, police officers, and it being reasonable for a police officer, that includes your training, your experience, and other things. That doesn't mean that you're just making a decision like a layperson was. You have been trained in the use of force continuum. You should have been trained in the use of force continuum. And so all of that come into play when you determine whether the actions taken by the officer was reasonable or was not reasonable. We're not talking about a person that haven't been to a training academy, that haven't had training, that haven't had some supervision. We're talking about a decision made by a trained police officers, and that is extremely important. In this particular case, again, my conclusion was in my report, it was justified because of him coming towards him. The problematic things, and I know I'm kind of speeding this up because of the time limit, was the flashbang grenade. I made a recommendation, or I would make a recommendation again tonight, that especially in Prince George's County, you have so many agencies in that jurisdiction in Prince George's County.
Hey, Mr. Powers, can I hop in here real quick? You know, I want you to take your time. Don't worry about my time limit, man. Yeah, I want you to be able to. We want to hear from you, man. You're the professional. We want to hear your recommendations. We want to hear your policies. So don't worry about my time limit. You know, we will get there. We'll slow you down when we need to, but don't worry about that. We want to hear from you directly, honestly. So
okay, well, thank you. Major Franklin know that I need a time limit because otherwise I can. Thank you for joining us tonight. But while I'm there, let me stop right there. A flashbang grenade, the kind of weaponry, a flashbang grenade being used. One of the recommendations is that you have so many police departments in Prince George's County. Unlike Baltimore City, you have one particular agency who's responsible for that jurisdiction. In Prince George's County, you have so many agencies that there has to be some communication. Every particular police agency have to know the capability, the weaponry, the training of every other agency. You almost have to have a uniform use of force policy, and you have to do joint training. And this have to start almost immediately, because at any given time, even tonight, based on the way Prince George's County is set up, if a police officer confronts a certain situation, he or she are going to call for backup. And he or she should know, and everyone else should know, that no matter what police department that backup come from, if they're in Prince George's County, they should know, they should be on the same page in terms of the use of force training. And they also should already know what weaponry may be brought to bear, because they should already know the policies, practices, the capabilities, and the weaponry of every other police department. That communication has to take place. There has to be a uniform use of force policy throughout the county, through every agency. There has to be joint training throughout every particular agency. And there has to be almost kind of a joint supervisory training. In many of these cases that I've reviewed over the years and testified in hundreds of course cases, given depositions and all, there's a key phenomenon that we always seem to miss. Even if we look at such national cases as the George Floyd case, the training of supervisors. If a supervisor had 12, hypothetically speaking, had 12 officers that he or she are responsible for, then that supervisor needs to be held accountable for the actions of the officers. Then I think what you'll see is a supervisor making sure that whatever use of force training policies or practices in place every night before he go out, he or she will say, listen, because they now have a fiduciary responsibility, or they also have some accountability. When I reviewed the George Floyd case as a little bit of an abstract for some other people, the fact that the officer kept his knee on his neck for so long meant that he wasn't even fearful that a supervisor might come by. That someone else, even someone that has supervisory responsibility over him. He wasn't, forget about his concern about the public. That's been debated, but he wasn't even concerned that my supervisor may come by and see this. So if supervisory training on use of force policy and practices, when they're put in place and changed, when supervisors, when they take those positions, are held responsible for the actions of their officers, you will see more accountability. You will see supervisors immediately going to the scene whenever there is potentially a use of force situation, and you will hold those supervisors responsible for knowing the use of force policies of every agency in that jurisdiction, so they know what's going to come to bear. One thing, and again, I hit that because we were right there with the flashbang grenade, which is a totally unique situation. But let me back up a little bit. I will say in this particular situation, the officers from the departments used some remarkable restraint throughout this particular case. They deployed maybe 6 different times less than lethal weaponry. For example, 3 different times they deployed a taser. They deployed it in the correct manner. They announced the taser, and then they announced whether it was effective or ineffective. They also tried to do a leg sweep to knock him off balance, which is another least than lethal method that they tried to use in this particular case. Even the shotgun beanbag is a less than lethal method. And then also, all the officers with good intent tried to talk down, use de-escalation techniques, verbal de-escalation techniques to talk down Mr. Shan in this particular situation. His death is tragic. There's no way we can feel, justification doesn't mean that it's okay. But they all tried to talk him down. But here's the problem with a jurisdiction like Prince George's County. This is why all the agencies have to be on the same page. They all have to communicate with each other. All of those officers, or a number of those officers, were talking to him at the exact same time. And when you have someone, and we're not talking about diagnosed, but clearly from everything we know and everything I reviewed, who was in the midst of a mental crisis. His angst, in fact, was with a police department, which he believed tried to hurt him, harm him, or kill him a few months ago. So he's not making a distinction between the Prince George's Police Department, the Mount Rainier, the Hyattsville, or the other department that he had problems with months earlier. When you already have that angst, you have so many people talking to you at one time, all maybe with good intent, none of them with malicious intent, all of them with good intent, all of them using de-escalation language, kind of like a verbal judo, telling him that, in fact, they didn't know about his other situation. If he put down the knives, they can sit and talk to him, give us an opportunity to talk to you. Even when he said, you're going to have to kill me here today, they said, we don't want to kill you. We don't want to harm you. At some point, Mr. Shan even approached the officers with the knife in hand, which strictly under the law, under the O'Connor versus Graham case, they could have used deadly force at that time, but they actually backed up even as he was approaching him with a knife. If you look at some of the video from some of the citizens who captured them on their cell phones, even the citizens were saying, he's approaching them with a knife and they're not shooting him. They're just letting him walk towards them. One citizen, because of the history of policing in this country, even actually said, is he black? Because in their mind, if he's black, he doesn't get that kind of leeway. So to show the restraint the officers used, they were backing up even as he walked towards them with a knife. And this conversation about from citizens in Prince George's County about they're not shooting him, he keeps walking towards them with a knife, he keeps threatening with a knife, the police officers keep backing up, also demonstrate remarkable restraint. So there's some things that were done that were very good. There's some other things that definitely need to be addressed and changed in policy, and some of it need to be changed immediately. The fact that I know the mobile crisis unit was called, I know that they were at least an hour out. If Prince George's County, like other jurisdictions across the country, and even in Maryland, can get a more robust mobile crisis unit, because the fact of the matter is, all statistics indicate a trend where police officers are likely to confront in some form or fashion people who are dealing with mental health issues. It's more likely than less likely, and COVID-19 haven't helped that. And so, and then while police officers are actually trained in de-escalation skills, they actually, the Maryland Police Training and Corrections Commission require them to know how to deal with a person who is dealing with a mental health crisis. They're not experts. And so whatever the cost is for a mobile crisis unit to be made more robust, that needs to be done, because you need people who are a specialist. Especially in this situation, when his angst is with police, it's hard for him to hear police talking him down when his anger is already with police. But a mental health practitioner. Now, I know that the mobile crisis unit, the specialists don't always go right to the scene. They have to stay away because they want to be protected. But having them be able to respond there more expeditiously and at least advise the officer who is closer to the individual may be able to de-escalate these situations and may be able to save lives. So that's a recommendation that I think that the county probably should move on expeditiously. I know it's an evolutionary process. You may not have the perfect mobile crisis unit, but it needs to be changed. It needs to be made more robust, and it needs to be done relatively quickly. So you have the supervisor accountability and the supervisor training. You have to have the joint training between all the agencies in Prince George's County. You have to have one use of force policy. You have to have one use of force policy, because if I arrive at the scene as a police officer, and let's say I'm from Prince George's County, and there's a Hyattsville officer on the scene, I need to know we're both operating from the same sheet. The use of force continuum in general go from mere presence to deadly force. Mere presence saying that just the presence of the officer is kind of some force. And we all kind of know that, whether, if you're a police officer get behind you, even if you're going the speed limit, the mere presence of a police car make you look down at your speedometer. Some of you probably are actually speeding, but even if you're not speeding, it causes you to look down, causes you to slow down. So the mere presence of an officer is kind of forced to an extent. And then we go to verbalization, with police officers talking to us, to command voice, to impact techniques, to pain compliance, and all the way up to deadly force. But that continuum and the justification for increasing any kind of force and being able to articulate, because if you can't articulate why I went to this level of force, you probably shouldn't be going there. That articulation, that training, that specific training, the ability to decide what force you need to use based on the individual who you are dealing with. Of course, in general, the training dictates, and I won't go through all that tonight, compliant, non-compliant, resistant, and combative, determines what level of force you're going to use at any particular group of time. But all the officers in your jurisdiction need to know that. All of them need to be on the same page, so that if I arrive there with an officer from another jurisdiction, no matter what uniform he or she are wearing tonight, I already know what they're going to do, because we've had the same training. I already know that a supervisor is en route. I already know who's going to take the lead and who's going to communicate with this particular individual, so they're not 9 of us yelling, and maybe with good intentions, but talking to an individual who may be in mental distress, right? Some of those things that I've mentioned can take place almost immediately. When the communication piece is so key, after 9/11, with the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, when the 911 did their commission, when they talked about all the federal agencies involved, they said it was a lack and a failure of communication and a failure of imagination. They already knew how to bring things together, but they never talked and communicated, even though they had the same mission, the same job, and some of them were in the same jurisdiction. Immediately after that, the federal agencies created a fusion center where one agent from each of the federal agencies sit together in a room and discuss lessons learned on a regular basis. They come together all the time. So there's no miscommunication between the chief of police in Hyattsville and the chief of police at the Prince George's County Police Department. They have a fusion center. Secondly, after the Waco incident with the FBI, with David Koresh, the FBI implemented a policy called infinite patience. And what that means is that we will wait as long as we can before we use any kind of force against anyone. Now, if they obviously, in this particular case, if they charge towards us, but up to that point, we will call the mobile crisis unit. We will talk to them from night to tomorrow morning. As long as no one's life is immediately in danger of death or serious bodily harm, we're not going to be in a rush to end this situation. We're going to get the professionals out there, because police have the responsibility to not only protect the citizens from an individual who may be a threat to them, but to protect that individual. He or she are still a citizen, even though you are trying to deal with them in that particular situation. So the policies have to dictate that. I think you need
Mr. Powers, can I hop in here real quick? You have a PowerPoint presentation that lists all your recommendations. Do you want to show those and go through those real quick? And then we can start asking questions, because I'm sure members of the group have a lot.
I mean, I didn't know, I didn't see it put up, so I didn't know whether it was available.
Yeah, I was trying to get the attention, but glad it's starting now. So sorry about that, but I know you got some really good recommendations on here, so I wanted to make sure you highlight. You're already going through most of these.
Okay,
So
you can move down to the recommendations then.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councilman. You can move down to the recommendation. But one of the things I think you can just scroll down on this and the way I set it up. I think, okay. Yeah, one of the things that I consistently mention is that constitutional policing and effective policing are not mutually exclusive. There's so much language, contentious language now, that if the police do it this way, then they're not doing effective policing. Policing was intended to be constitutional from the very beginning. The training counts, and during the training, even though I'm talking about annual cross-jurisdictional training, where you bring all the agencies together in Prince George's County for joint training on use of force, on who takes the lead when we have a situation like we had with the Hyattsville shooting, on what weaponry that each police department has, so we already know what they have, so I don't have to guess who's going to bring, because if there was a lot of communication about who has a shotgun beanbag, who has this device, who has that device, who's deploying tasers, you should already know that. And a joint response, and it kind of helps you with de-escalating the situation, and you feel more confident, and you know what resources are there. Supervisory joint jurisdictional training, but also joint jurisdictional training of all new officers that come in. Because despite what they've gotten in the academy, now you're asking them to work with other jurisdictions, other agencies, and other officers to communicate with them in a joint, in a common purpose. Because no matter what police department you are with, technically, if you join for the right reason, you have the exact same purpose. I talked about enhancement of the mobile crisis unit. Whatever barriers they are, you know, I always say this to jurisdictions, and some of them have already enhanced and changed their mobile crisis unit. It is less expensive to make a more robust mobile crisis unit than it is to pay out civil lawsuits. Whatever it costs you, don't see it as an expense, see it as an investment. Because again, increasingly, jurisdictions are going to be dealing with people with mental health crisis. And we know that. So we can't really form too many more focus groups to study that. We know you have to move on that expeditiously. Again, the joint training of the police agencies at multiple agencies, and especially along with all the officers, the supervisors, and the command staff, joint policies about how to deal with these issues. Councilman, you can scroll down. A fusion center that brings the officers from all these organizations together, a robust civilian review board with citizen participation. Now, civilian review boards, you don't want these boards, and I've said this historically in the different cities that I've gone to, you don't want them to be just emotional. So if you want civilian members on the civilian review board, but you want them to be trained in the same thing that we're talking about tonight. You want them to understand O'Connor versus Graham. You want them to understand community policing. You want to understand the use of force continuum. You don't want to just have people in positions of power appoint people to these positions because they're great community activists. You want these people trained to understand this, so that when they come together on that review board, they're doing a serious, I'm not saying devoid of emotion, but a serious intellectual review. The problem with emotional responses is they only last a short period of time, and then we default back into what we were doing before. If they're not based on knowledge, then they move back to the FBI Academy. Used to always tell us you will never effectively change anything that you don't completely understand. So they said superficial understanding can only lead to superficial results. So this civilian review board, the individuals coming onto the board have to go through almost an academy, not the way police officers go through, but so that you should have citizens there. There's no doubt you need that. but they also should be trained in the things that we're talking about today, the different options with de-escalation, the engagement techniques, police policies and practices, the purpose of police policies, practices, and training, and so on and so forth. And I'll add this very quickly to this. Reuben Greenberg, who was the chief of police in South Carolina, went down there and did a unique thing, and something that I think that Prince George's, some of the things that I think that you can do as I continue to work with the state's attorney and make more recommendations. He even put in policy that police officers could never use profanity towards citizens. And even when citizens balked at that, even when police officers balked at that initially, the FOP, he said to them, and they said, well, people use profanity towards us. What he said to them was, but I paid for you to get trained. If you're going to compare your behavior to the behavior of someone that I have never gone through the academy, then what was the purpose of sending you through an academy? I can demand more discipline, more focus with you. I can demand a higher level of professionalism, and you should never compare your behavior to the behavior of a citizen who have not gone through the academy, because the academy is supposed to produce a better officer, or an officer that understands the law. So he even put those things in place. He put in place all use of force had to be articulated in writing. It could be a minor use of force, could be a one-page paper, but if you felt it was justified, you should be able to articulate it and put it in writing. And then that fusion center, or that end of the year review, all those agencies can come together and look at lessons learned and learn how to get better, because it's an evolutionary process. Learn how to get better. So those policies have been put in place at other places, and they have been effective. You can scroll down. I think there's a few more. Is that it?
There we go.
Removal of no knock warrants. Now, I know police departments have a hard time with this, but the reality of the matter is, the problem with no knock warrants, if you look at the history of them, if you look at them across this particular country, when they're executed, any furtive move, once the police go into a room and they do a no knock warrant, when they break into the door, any move that anyone make is going to end up being part of the justification for the police using their weapons. So I know that they can be a useful tool, but I think that the negative is so much more than any positive you could get out of a no-knock warrant. There's other methods you can use. You can wait people out. You can wait till they come out. You can do other things. And I know they have some benefit, but the reality of the matter is that I've mentioned this to the state's attorney, and I was a police officer. I was a special agent with the FBI. I've executed these warrants, and I know that there's some value to them, but I would argue that the disadvantages far outweigh any advantages, and that whenever you do a no-knock warrant, if someone is hurt in that particular situation, police officers are obviously going to indicate that someone made a sudden move. At the time that they made that move, they thought their life was in danger. I just don't see a place for them. And I guess we could have a further discussion about that. But if you have to have them in emergency situations and situations where they're totally necessary, then I strongly suggest a 3-tier approval process. I think they should have to be completely vetted by the police chief, the state's attorney, and somebody from the county executive's office before they even go before a judge, to have a judge sign off on that warrant. These things can be helpful, but they also can be extremely problematic and extremely dangerous. And the warrants I've served, anyone who, it could be the mother, anyone that moves once you hit that door for no-knock warrant, you're more or less likely than less likely to use force, and in all too many cases, deadly force, unfortunately. Enhanced supervisory training and oversight, and then I think I've got one more that I will end with, and then take any questions. Two more actually. Joint agency critiques of multiple agencies coming together and doing a joint critique. Get the ego out of it. Put everybody in a room. Talk about risk management. Talk about coming together. Talk about how we can do this better. But bringing everyone together to have those conversations. And then finally, you can go to the last one. Finally, the yearly tabulations of lessons learned. I mean, even with the recommendations I've been doing with the state's attorney, what I've tried to do and what I continue to do is continue to add recommendations, tabulate them, and continue to talk about lessons learned. And I think that if all the agencies come together, they can have a discussion, a tabulation of lessons learned, and they can get better every year, even as an evolutionary process. But that's going to take some communication. In closing, I'll just say this. Some of these recommendations just can't wait. We don't have the luxury of time. I know during the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, they said schools need to be integrated with all deliberate speed. We still don't know what that means. There's still schools that are segregated. And that was in 1954. So we can't use that kind of language with all deliberate speed. They have to be carefully, methodically. I know they have, you shouldn't rush them, but at the same time, I've been involved with so many police organizations to put together focus groups, and 2 years later you go back and they say, we're still talking about that. And I don't think we have the luxury of that. You certainly don't have the luxury of that in Prince George's County. The likelihood of confrontation is greater now, maybe than ever, with everything that's going on in the nation, and also with the mental health crisis that we're dealing with, that we have to acknowledge. So whatever this group began to put together and recommend, I suggest that some of them you prioritize and not only try to recommend them, but maybe put a timeline on them and see how expeditiously you can get them implemented. So thank you. I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Judge Lemassney? Yeah.
I don't have any questions. I thought it was an extremely impressive presentation. So thank you very much, Dr. Powers.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you as well. And we'll start taking any questions from members. Our first question we have up is Ms. Krista Oriata.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Pleasure to see you again. I think one of the things with this case that you highlighted, and just watching the footage, I know we were talking about the restraint, but for me, it's seeing what I think is really going back to that lack of training. And so just trying to understand the types of training that already exist, because you mentioned like I think the leg sweep and things of that nature, but I'm just curious, is there current training already in the department that you're aware of that focuses on disarming individuals with different types of weapons, being, you know, a knife, let's say a bat or a pipe, gun, like at different levels? Because I just like am struggling when you've seen cases where just individuals with no training, you know, have disarmed gunmen and other people, and both survived, and you see 9 or 10 officers not able to disarm someone with a knife without it ending in murder. So just understanding like what kind of training already exists for that in Prince George's County, and just in your experience, are there types of training that we don't offer that you've seen in other jurisdictions that really focus on the ways in which you can disarm someone when you have multiple officers that don't lead to murder or death?
There's some training along those lines. I just want to be completely honest with you. And as she indicated, more times than not, in many of my civil cases, I've actually talked about when force was excessive, but it is extremely difficult to disarm someone with a knife. No matter your training, no matter your background, it is extremely difficult to have an officer approach someone with a knife without serious bodily injury to the officer or death, in fact, to the particular officer. It's a difficult situation. In this particular case, some of the methods that we used were highly questionable, I agree. But what I was giving credit for was the fact that they tried to use less than lethal force at a time when, in some of those instances, according to the Supreme Court ruling, they would have been justified in using deadly force. The method of using a vehicle, I don't really know where that come from. I think Sergeant Gleason and I talked about this. I think if they'd have ran over him, that's use of deadly force. That's a method that is probably not taught. But what I think they did try to do is not run over him, just to knock him off balance. So it's unique. I think that's where the training can come in play, that we can get a better hold on things like that, a better hold on the leg sweep. And you're right, there are examples where people have disarmed people. They are exceptional and extraordinary examples, and they're good examples of that. But the reality of the matter is, to be quite frank and honest with you, if someone is running towards you with a knife or someone has a knife, that is a difficult proposition at the time that occurred, because a knife is a deadly weapon, and that's a difficult proposition. I'm glad you have Neil Franklin on. I've worked with him. He's the head of training for Baltimore City Police Department. Maybe he can add to that. Again, I think there's a lot of things that could be done better. There's a lot of training that can be improved upon, even in this particular situation. And I think that some of the recommendations dealt with that, and some of the conversations I've had with the officers have indicated that. But any specific training about how to disarm a person with a knife, that take a unique set of skills and a higher level of training than you're likely to get in a Maryland Police Training and Corrections Academy program in the state of Maryland. Neil, any comment on that?
Mr. Neil, you want to introduce yourself first as well? Tell us where you're from. Thank you.
Sure. My name is Neil Franklin. I'm the current executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and 34 years policing in the state of Maryland. Retired from the Maryland State Police as the head of training in 1999, and then went to Baltimore City as the head of training for 4 years, and then 6 years with Maryland Transit, chief of patrol, and some other positions that I held. So Dr. Powers is correct when it comes to that type of training. We put the Baltimore Police Department, the entire police department, back in the early 2000s through some specialized training from a Navy SEAL and how to disarm people with things like baseball bats and sticks and pipes and those things, which are completely different from an edged weapon. One of the things about an edged weapon is you don't know the skill sets of the person who holds that edged weapon. You can guess, but if someone is extremely skilled in using that knife, they can do some serious damage to you in a very short period of time, and you bleed out very quickly. The training that we typically give regarding edged weapons is basically two categories. Number one, if you're so close to that person when a knife is displayed, yes, we give you some skill sets that you can use, because there's no way you can get your firearm out to defend yourself with a firearm. So you have to have some basic skill sets, hopefully being able to disarm that person, or at least to do enough where you don't end up losing your life. The second part of that is to create distance if it is at all possible. And Dr. Powers spoke regarding this particular case, that the officers continue to back up, creating that distance and keeping that distance. But there comes a point where if that person decides that they want to close on you quickly, it's very easy to do so. And again, you don't know the skill sets of that person regarding their speed, their quickness, and the use of the knife. So it is a very difficult decision to make for a police officer who's put in line with these circumstances. But one of the things that Dr. Powers said that is extremely important is regarding the cross-department training, especially when you have many police departments in a small geographical area. They need to train together. They need, like we've done with active shooters, police officers from different agencies, when they respond to an active shooter, they've all had the same training, and they know how to go into a building or approach someone who's an active shooter. And they know their different roles and different positions, who's going to communicate. Like Dr. Powers said, one person communicating. So, training is the key, and not just training one time, but it has to be repetitive. And then it has to be supported by follow-up and accountability regarding the training that they receive. So that's just there's a lot to it, but that's just a brief cap.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Pastor Robinson.
Yes, Dr. Powers, appreciate your presentation. I don't think any reasonable citizen has an issue with justifiable use of force. My concern from personal experience and what I hear on the streets is unjustifiable use of force that somehow turns out to be justifiable. That's a real concern. Also, you talked about the no knock. As you talked about that, I've thought about a whipping that I got from a mother with a belt. And every time she hit me, she asked me to hold still. stop moving. You know, you hit me with this belt, but at the same time, you asking me to stop moving. You tased me and you asked me to put my hands behind my back. You know, so a movement is somehow made to be justifiable because I broke into a door and killed somebody, and somehow that comes out to be justifiable. It's just, you scare the heck out of me. I'm not thinking right, and a whole lot of other stuff, and die because of it, and it ends up being justifiable. So you know, I'm looking for an answer for that unjustifiable homicide or murder that ends up being justifiable, and how we can kind of get to that. I'm speaking from personal experience. I struggled with a police officer, and had I not struggled to keep myself alive, that would have been justifiable. However, it ended up in court, the jury trial, and everything else. This man was found to be lying, the whole works. They threw it out of court, and all they did to this officer was move him from one jurisdiction, one precinct, to another. I think that's where the public's concerns are. That's where my concerns are. Experience the same things his granddad and father experienced. So those are the issues that I'm looking to address. I don't think anybody would have a problem with a police officer in a justifiable situation protecting himself. I don't think any citizen would have a problem with that. But the concern is there's a lot of folks getting away with stuff that they call justifiable. It's actually murder.
Yeah, two quick responses to that for the sake of time. This is where I think that the increased accountability of supervisors play an important role, and the training. See, when we do training on use of force, we tell police officers when to shoot, not to shoot, what level of force they can use. But use of force training has to include a great deal more than that. When people join the police department, they join for a number of reasons. Some people just want more control. They're socialized. Whatever brought them to that point of joining the police department, you can teach them technique. But unless you are instructing them, and to the state's attorney's credit, one of the reasons that she came and spoke to me and we sat down and had a number of meetings is to help with this particular process from people who have been through the training and kind of understand use of force. That socialization process to bring people into the police department has to be addressed too in your use of force training. The mental capacity, not capacity, I don't want to say so much, of the officers in which you are training. Because I can teach you all the techniques. I can teach you to run 10 miles. But at some point, there's something beyond the physical, when to pull a gun, when to fire the gun, when to use the knife, that has to take place in the course of the training. And I think that's what we're working on. I think that's what I've been working with, partly with the state's attorney's office on, those kind of intangibles that if you look at a sheet, if the police department provides you a sheet of the training they put their officers through, you look at the sheet and go down there. But the other pieces, the things that are not said, the things in the middle about the mental capacity, the training, the socialization, what made you see this person as a threat in the first place, and so on and so forth. Those are the things that are important. And until we fix that, that's part of my problem with the no not warrants. Until we fix that, again, if you go into someone's door for no not warrant and you haven't had that, you're going to be able to justify it in terms of technique. But the reality of the matter is there's some other things at play that cause you to use that force so quickly and to then justify based on training and technique. So I understand exactly what you're saying. Hopefully this task force and the work on this task force and my work with you via the state's attorney's office can get to some of those things you can do. I will say this though, I do believe that this is less complex than I think that with strong leadership, accountable supervision, those first line supervisors saying that if someone who you are responsible for, because a lot of people get promoted to be first line supervisors and they're good managers, but they're not good leaders. If you tell them that if you've got 12 people that's on the street tonight and one of them do something awfully wrong, you two are going to be held accountable, then I would think you even see supervisors demanding better and more training. They will begin to pull out certain officers and say, look, you may can get you in trouble, but you damn sure not going to get me in trouble. And I think those are the kind of things that we can put in place almost immediately. And I don't think any police department across your county, even with this task force, would resist that if you made that kind of mandate or suggestion, not mandate, to take place by January the 1st. And I keep saying that because I've been involved with so many organizations, even with Neil Franklin and so many police trainings across the country. And I go back 2 years later and they're still doing focus groups. And I'm saying some things can wait, but other things you have to expedite because the likelihood of this happening to you, Pastor, or someone else again, or someone is maybe tonight. Now, I know we can't change it tonight, but we do have to move with a sense of urgency and not so much pontification.
Thank you. We do have a few more questions and another presentation. And so I'm gonna ask Ms. Josephine Morning to ask her a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Powers, for your presentation. My question is directed towards the fact that the community feels that the police is actually trained to shoot to kill. Now, I can understand a situation when they go and the person got a gun and everything, but in a situation where they have an object, including a knife, and especially in a situation where you have a standoff of 30 minutes, it would seem that we would have somebody on the police force who is a better shooter, who could actually disable this person like in the leg or something like this, and this would actually disable him, but not take the life of the person. So have we looked into possibly people who have experience? Because if you look at the Secret Service, I have a lot of friends who were Secret Service agents. They are trained to shoot, not to kill, because they want that person to live in case there's a conspiracy. So why can't we, you know, in Prince George's County, also sort of set up parameters like that? If it's a gun that they have, I understand a gun, but if it's a knife, it seems that someone should have the shooting skills that they could shoot him in the leg, and that will disable him, and at least he lives. Thank you.
And that may be possible. I know in the FBI and in the agencies I've been associated with, we was told to shoot to stop. And to stop, and you didn't really shoot to kill, but you shot to stop, and they taught us to shoot twice center mass, to be quite frank with you, in order to stop the threat. And they also trained us that if you have decided to use your firearm, the real possibility of someone dying can take place. So before you make that decision, understand that may happen. To have sharpshooters as police officers on the street for every particular situation, I think is a difficult kind of scenario. I think police officers, when you fire your weapon, it's called deadly force because the likelihood of someone being seriously injured or maybe even killed is likely. So the question becomes, before you make that decision, again, if someone is charging at me with a knife, I'm shooting to stop that threat. I'm not, because if I miss the leg and I miss the arm and I miss the, but if I've been trained through targets, through my training academy to stop the threat, then that's what I'm trying to do. And if I don't believe I'm justified in stopping the threat, then I probably shouldn't be using deadly force. That's where we are now. I'm not saying that's not a possibility. And I know you were talking about the Secret Service, but I know the federal agency that I was associated with, we weren't allowed to fire warning shots. We weren't even allowed to have a safety on our weapons. They said, when you pull that weapon and decide to fire it, make sure you can articulate why deadly force was necessary. That's when you go through that process. But once you do that, your sole objective is to stop the threat. That's how we were trained, and I think that's how most police agencies are trained, unless they all have something different.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. We look a lot at policing in Europe. We actually have a branch in Europe, the organization does. And in most of our European countries, they kill a lot fewer people than we do here in the United States. And I'm talking about people who have edged weapons, who have knives. And a lot of it is because of the training, the extensive training that police officers get in many of these countries. It's not 6 months, it's a year, it's more, it's 18 months, it's 2 years, higher levels of education, better at developing their judgmental skills. The problem here in the United States regarding police training is the politics involved and the rush to get police officers to the street, from the academy to the street. So if you can take the politics out of these training academies and training divisions and understand that you need to devote the time and the energy, not just for the initial training, but the follow-up and remedial training that has to happen every year. If you're willing to invest in that at the beginning, you'll find at the back end, you're going to save a lot of lives, you're going to save a lot of money in lawsuits, and at the end of the day, you're going to need fewer police officers to do the work. But you've got to make the investment, just like we need to make the investment in our neighborhoods and in our communities for the things that matter to the people, right? That work in reducing violent crimes and improving public safety.
Mr. Franklin, can you send us that information that you have on those other countries about a year-long process and what that looks like, and what the weeks or months of training that they go through for that 12-month training or that 18-month training?
Sure, I'll work with Dr. Powers, who has the contact information, and get it to you.
Appreciate it, sir. Thank you very much. Mr. Lottridge.
First, thank you for the presentation. I agree with your recommendations. I'll probably match mine exactly, but I want to talk about two things. One, the Leonard Shand case. And to be clear, I met with Leonard Shand. I knew him prior to this incident from some other stuff. The scene is horrific in that it's chaotic, and so many officers. And given Mr. Shand's prior, I think he'd been hospitalized, I'm sure you know, several times from interactions with the police, and the police in that area knew him. My concerns, I understand when someone's charging an officer with a knife, I understand that. My concerns is the creation of that chaotic scene where there are that many officers. They're yelling at this man who, given the history, and some of those officers knew the history and the fact that he'd been hospitalized after interactions with officers. Is there a policy that can be created where one agency comes in, takes a scene, and basically everything was escalating during that entire event, including we're going to shoot you with this, we're going to do that. At no point did it, from what I saw, did it appear that this man was given an option other than this continued escalation. And that appeared to me because there was just so many people and different agencies kind of all acting at the same time. Is there something we can recommend or that you recommend where basically one person, one unit comes in and takes over when something like this is going on, and it's something that's practical that can happen on these everyday events?
Yeah, so that's especially, and that's especially the case in Prince George's County because you have so many departments. Like, so that's part of what I meant by the communication, the training, the agencies coming together and deciding, depending on where jurisdiction this is in, who's going to take the lead, who's going to have the conversation, who's going to engage in the de-escalation. I will say this as you speak to this particular situation, because they haven't had that joint communication, that joint training with all the agencies, every officer was trying to communicate with him to put his knife down. But again, because they were doing it from their own individual training, from not a coordinated particular effort, not communicating with each other. Not all of them didn't even know when the flashbang was no one knew when the flashbang was going to be deployed except the officer who deployed it. Usually there's some communication about that. People didn't know when the beanbag shotgun was going to show up. Some people did and some people didn't. So the lack of coordination and communication when you have multiple jurisdictions. So you can easily, with some of the recommendations we have here, fix that situation because you can delineate with joint training and joint communication. If we get to a multi-agency scene like this again, and you very well might, because when you're a police officer and you're confronting someone with a knife, you call for backup. You don't really care what uniform they wear or what agency they come from, but at least you would like to know that we're all on the same page when they get there. So I think some of the recommendations that we talked about the agency's doing lessons learned, doing joint training. I think even yesterday, speaking to Sergeant Gleason, they began to do an executive summary, and they did meet with Hyattsville Police Chief. So I think this process is starting. I think this task force can make sure that it's expedited. I think that you wouldn't have any pushback from anybody along those lines. And I think that's what happened in this situation. I think you're right. Everybody was talking to him, but if you listen to what they were saying on the presentation, everybody was trying to convince him to put the knife down. They weren't trying to talk to him to escalate it. They were trying to de-escalation. But when you're dealing with someone in a crisis situation, that many voices coming at you at the same time. Secondly, there were so many officers there and they were following him, but there was other considerations from a very tactical standpoint. And again, by Neil working with me and Powers Consulting and other things, you are not only walking with him to deal with him, you're walking with him because there was a school bus that someone had to go and move back. There were citizens that had to be moved back. And if you watch the film, officers are doing, even though they're walking, they're moving citizens back. They're moving the school bus back. They're telling cars to go out of the area. In fact, one time a car even came close and the officer said what he's doing. Some officer had to go deal with that. So you're dealing with the individual who you are having the situation with, but you also have to possess situational awareness that there's other things around you. And that's why sometimes you need that many officers. They just have to be tasked in a different way. And joint communication may mean that you have that situation. You say, okay, if you arrive, your job is to stop the traffic. Your job, we only need this many people to talk to him. And I think that can be done expeditiously.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to, we're going to have, Mr. Powers, you're going to stick around with us too a little later?
Sure.
Okay. I see you looking at the clock. Okay. We do have just a couple more questions, and I do want to have Ms. Roth do her presentation as well. But let me go to Mr. Councilmember Streeter, and I did want to recognize Sergeant Gleason, who's the Prince George's County Police Department's use of force expert. And Mr. Gleason, please let me know when you want to hop in here to in some of these questions that are asked as well. Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Mr. Streeter, Councilman Streeter, you're on mute, sir.
Thanks for a great presentation and really good discussion. I'm a firm believer in police getting to know the community in advance of these incidents happening, and maybe they could even head some of those off. So I was wondering what thoughts you had around what effective community policing effort should look like, and what value we should place on that, and maybe some recommendations on, where you've seen that done the best.
Yeah, I have a lot of recommendations on that. In fact, I'll put them together and make sure that you get them through Ms. Danzo at the State's Attorney's Office, but I'll make sure you get them expeditiously. That's an extremely important concept. You have to know the human terrain. You have to know the community. There's no way you're going to be successful. I'm not just talking about in situations like this, but I'm talking about because this is, no one can call this successful because a man lost his life. But in dramatically reducing crime and getting more police community cooperation, there's methods that could be put in place expeditiously. But again, that's going to be that's going to have to be part of the training too, especially with new officers coming out and supervisors. That's going to have to be key. But I'll get those to you. Excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Delegate Fisher, are you still on? Do you have a question? Give me 1 second. Delegate Fisher, are you there? Let me ask her a question for you, since she's probably muted somewhere. Can you make a recommendation on how to check in on officers before he or she does a bad act? And should sustained/unsustained complaints trigger a retraining at some point? What would you recommend?
I think right. I think definitely for the last question, I think definitely complaints should trigger at least some intervention and some engagement. I think that's necessary. I think that's an easy yes. And I think many agencies have that in place. Some agencies are moving towards that. I don't know exactly, maybe Sergeant Gleason know what the situation is in Prince George's County with the Prince George's County Police Department. Obviously, anytime you have a shooting situation, then engagement and conversation and lessons learned and all that kind of thing is done. But in general, I would absolutely agree, and I can make that recommendation and kind of expand upon it when I send the recommendations out.
Got it. Okay. And my question is about this citizens oversight or citizens review panel that you spoke to a little bit and strengthening it. And you mentioned providing training for them so they understand what use of force is and what all these other pieces are as well. And it seems like that becomes more of a full-time position. And that's kind of the issue that we have in our county of these folks being part-timers. Therefore, it's hard for them to commit the time to doing the work, although they're doing as much work as they possibly can with such little resources. What citizen review panel have you seen that works extremely well, that provides accountability, that gives them some independence, and that provides them with the full resources that they need in order to be effective at their job?
Yeah, that's key for them to be robust, for them to have some independence. And again, it's the piece I talked about before, for them to have some knowledge and some training. And they do need time to review the cases. They need the full cooperation of all the police agencies and of course of the state's attorney's office and everyone else. The difficulty is that in some of these civilian review boards, how much information gets shared with them is pretty limited. They get the case file. I know that we had a situation, which I don't mind speaking to, in Baltimore City, where they had a contentious relationship between the city's lawyer, solicitor, and the civilian review board, so much so that the civilian review board was essentially ineffective, and they're trying to fix that right now. So I can probably provide you with some information on civilian review boards that work and the way they should work, in terms of them being part-time or full-time and the work they do. I think that if they're given full cooperation, if they're given the proper training, the proper guidance, and the proper materials that they need to thoroughly review these cases, and they need to know what they're looking at, then I think that you could probably do it, maybe not as a full-time position, but what takes so long is just, in many cases, when I've witnessed civilian review boards, of them just trying to get some information from the entities, whether it's the police department, the state's attorney's office, or the other entities. It takes so much time, because if you had everything there, then you could choose a night to review a number of cases, but you find yourself holding the case over the next week, waiting from a response from the police department or someone else. So I think a lot of those other things is a factor too, and how effective they are.
Thank you, sir. Well, I want to thank you on behalf of the work group for this was a very detailed presentation on use of force policies, and you provided some recommendations that I know that our work group is going to consider significantly. And so if you can send that work to us, you and Mr. Franklin, we really appreciate it as we have to, develop our recommendations. But if you don't mind sticking around, if you have to go, that's fine. But if you don't mind sticking around, that'd be great too. But I wanted to introduce and move on to Miss Chrissy Roth.
Delegate, I'm sorry, Delegate Washington, really quickly before you move on, I hate to interject, but I just wanted to make a quick point of clarification, if I may.
Okay, sure.
On the issue of no knocks. So I know that we in the state's attorney's office already have that sort of tiered and coordinated approach that Dr. Powers spoke about, specifically as it relates to no knocks. And Mr. Powers may not have been aware because we didn't engage with him on the issue of no knocks, but that approach is coordinated by and between our office, of course, the police department, and the court. And so those warrants are not given the green light or even considered unless they are approved by the team of individuals in our office that are charged with that level of oversight first. And that coordination has really been working well. So I just wanted to make that clear, because I know obviously this has been an area of concern for our public post Breonna Taylor, who I know is listening. So I thought that was important to share.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And we appreciate that. And we'll with that clarity, we'll move on to Miss Chrissy Roth, who's here with us. She's with Amnesty International, and she'll be speaking to police use of force statutes. And Ryan, if we can throw up her PowerPoint presentation, please. I actually saw this young lady do a presentation in front of the in front of the state's work group on police accountability, and I was very impressed with her work. And so I asked her and kind of stalked her on Twitter to ask her to do this event, event with us. And that's pretty much how you got to connect with these social justice warriors out here through social media. So I really appreciate you being here, Ms. Roth, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Delegate Washington. I've just over 1,000 followers, so I appreciate the stalking. And if anybody else wants to endeavor in that same way via my Twitter account, but I do very much appreciate the invitation. And again, as you mentioned in my presentation before, the legislature's working group on policing. And so, as Delegate Washington mentioned, I've been invited here today to speak a bit about police use of force. That has been is an issue, a central issue for Amnesty International, something that we've been working on for the last 5 years. And so I'm going to talk a bit about the issue from the global, sort of actual perspective of what the sort of Supreme Court jurisprudence says or what Maryland's law looks like, and also make some concrete recommendations about what statute should have. And look, someone's already followed me, so obviously that worked. You can go, and I guess before we move to the next slide, I'll just say that my role at Amnesty is to be our advocate on all of our criminal justice issues. That program principally focuses on policing, specifically on use of force, and also our efforts to abolish the death penalty. So I keep pretty busy these days. I do the work at the state and federal level, so it's always a pleasure to be here with y'all in Maryland since I'm just across the border in DC. You can move to the next slide. So just from a big picture human rights standpoint, we all have certain human rights that are associated with our interactions with law enforcement. Those include our right to life, our right to security of a person, or that's also sometimes referred to as a right to be safe, our right to be free from discrimination, and equal protection of law, which is of course quite similar to those words that are inscribed on the Supreme Court of the USA, of the US, I should say. Words that are inscribed on the Supreme Court of the USA. Sorry, of the US, I should say.
Hey, Tammy.
You might have to mute. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks. It's all right. And then some of these key principles from an international standards and legal perspective, which I think are really quite similar to those same sort of training and policy principles, no doubt, that Mr. Powers spoke about, or that certainly I know that Neil probably would speak about, as far as proportionality. The amount of force that's used should be no more than is necessary to accomplish a task. It should meet whatever the proportion of force that an officer may face. The legality is that an officer's principal job is to enforce the law, and they should act within that as well. Accountability, that should an officer transgress the law, that there be recourse for redress in that. And then necessity is sort of an important concept that's similar to proportionality, about the sort of limitations on how force should be used. If you could advance. Thank you. So just from a big picture standpoint, that image you saw on the last slide is our 2015 Deadly Force Report that really introduced Amnesty's work into the space. And from that report, we came up with some key findings that are really listed here on this slide, just for a reference going into the issue that in our survey of these issues, there's not a single state nor our federal laws that meet international law or standards for the use of deadly force. So it's my very difficult job to try to push states and the federal government to get closer. There's 9 states that don't have a use of force law at all. So that includes y'all in Maryland. Just Tennessee and Delaware require police to exhaust reasonable options before using deadly force. 9 states allow deadly force to suppress a riot, which feels incredibly important in this moment where there's a lot of people protesting. Maryland is not one of those states, but there are states that have that. And there are just 3 states that require officers create no substantial risk when using deadly force to a third party. That one's also pretty rare and important to think about. And again, on the side here, we have just the differentiation between states that require a warning, a verbal warning, that is, specifically. Can advance to the next slide. So this slide is very text heavy, but it includes some important distinctions of what international and US laws look like with regard to use of force. Starting with the US side, the general principle outlined or standard for force is that it be objectively reasonable in light of the facts and circumstances confronting a police officer. And this sort of reasonableness standard or objectively reasonable officer standard is really highlighted and most prominently named through Graham versus Garner in 1989, where the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, and its calculus must embody an allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second decisions about the amount of force necessary in a particular situation. So that essentially is what the law is in Maryland based on this Supreme Court case. The other piece that's really a definitive part of US use of force law comes from Tennessee versus Garner, just a few years before Graham, and that it prohibits the use of force unless it's necessary to prevent the escape of a fleeing felon. An officer has probable cause to believe that the suspect poses a significant threat of violence to the officer or the community. Also phrased occasionally as another person. So that particular jurisprudence is sometimes referred to as the fleeing felon standard. And the case was of a young man who was robbing a house, and as he was running away, officers shot him. So those are what our laws look like in the US. As far as what international law and standards provides, which principally for that, we're looking at the UN basic principles of use of force and firearms. They say that lethal force is only permitted as a last resort to protect an officer or others from death or serious bodily injury. That sometimes shows up, not last resort, but the second part often shows up in police department policies. No other means are available or likely to obtain a legitimate legal objective. That's how we should read that. If force is unavoidable, it must be no more than is necessary and proportionate to achieve the objective. Thinking back to those two first elements. And lastly, that law enforcement must use it in a manner that is designed to minimize damage or injury, must respect and preserve human life, and ensure medical aid are provided as soon as possible to the injured or affected. So I think we see a huge contrast of the way that our laws read. And so I really appreciate that Prince George's County is at least seeking to learn more so that we can provide greater clarity to these laws for the county as far as how force may be used in a way that's limited and truly respects human life in the way that I'm sure you all want to. Next slide. So just an example of some states that have actually put in place more restrictive standards on use of force. In California, this was a sort of 2-year effort that started with the death of Stephon Clark in 2018. California was a state that had a pretty poor use of force standard in that, as you'll see on this third bullet here, they didn't even meet the fleeing felon standard as far as is outlined in Tennessee versus Garner. So they tightened that element of their use of force statute. They restricted use of force to only when necessary to address an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to an officer or another person, which is as clear as it gets across use of force statutes across the country. There are a lot of use of force statutes that include the word necessary, but that's not quite the same as what's being called upon through the international standards and principles. Often those statutes immediately before citing the word necessary say reasonably necessary, which is not quite the same. Necessity has to include elements from an international perspective, that force be used in a way that is temporal and that it stop to when it is no longer needed, or that it not be deemed not when it's deemed that it cannot be successful, not used at all. It needs to be used in a way that is like whether force of any kind should be used. And then the third element is that force be used like the sort of degree of force that's used as well, which thinks most closely with proportionality. And so this law doesn't outline all of those three things, but by the way they've included necessary here, we do think it's a really good step in the right direction. One other important thing that California's law does that no other law in the US does as of yet is it asks the legal system to examine the officer and the subject leading up to the use of force incident and the totality of the circumstances provision, which I've italicized that because totality of the circumstances has significant meaning with regard to Graham versus Garner. So what's important to understand here is that as courts have understood Graham versus Garner, as I talked about a few prior slides, it's really just the moment that force takes place, not the things that lead up to that. And I'm sure we can think of examples in Maryland, in Prince George's County, and certainly some very high profile examples, the best one probably being Tamir Rice, a young man who was playing with a toy weapon when officers arrived on the scene. It took a matter of seconds before they shot at him, and they also pulled up very close to him, so they had very few other options to take any other action in that circumstance. And so when we think about what officers can do to de-escalate before that, that's why it's important that we consider if an officer themselves creates a need for force because of their own negligent actions. But that also goes both ways. It should be balanced on the subject as well. Next slide. So these recommendations are things that I hope that you all consider including in your use of force county statute, and that officers should be required to identify themselves to the extent that it's reasonable when they are engaging with a subject. Certainly we've seen examples where that hasn't happened. And for example, the Breonna Taylor case, like, certainly her boyfriend wasn't aware that police had actually come through the door. And that's what he said is why he shot them, is he didn't know they were police in the first place. Officers should de-escalate a situation, and they should give a warning that says, if this action is not ceased, then force will be used. You should look at more expansive definitions of deadly force, in that you should include that certain tactics could cause deadly force, whether or not that's how they're perceived. Certainly, someone could die as a result of a chokehold. Chokeholds may not necessarily be intended to cause death, but should they cause death? I think it's important to note that, as well as that multiple discharges of a taser or electronic weapon also may cause death. As far as limitations to less than lethal or deadly force, as I spoke about, really inspired by some of these international principles, is that force should be reserved to only when necessary as a last resort, when there is an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to another person. Officers should not create substantial risk to a third party, and they should exhaust reasonable options. And so thinking about what I presented about the international standards and what laws already exist around the US, I've looked at both of these things, and that is really where my recommendations come from, is what we believe is the most clear language that could really help save people's lives. And then next slide. I was also asked to make some other recommendations about just general transparency and accountability. So forgive me if the county has already considered some of these things, but as an advocate on the federal level, a lot of these are part of the conversations we have. But I certainly wouldn't encourage any state or locality to wait for the federal government to do anything. So if these are things you can take up on your own, and hopefully I have created a list that would imply, you should certainly think about it. I know during the Senate's hearing, I guess that was a couple weeks ago, there was a recommendation about an officer misconduct database. I think the person presenting, he and I would disagree that we do think that information should be public. And by the kind of misconduct specifically, I'm talking about officers who have, citations for like sexual assault, excessive force, violation of civil rights, these kinds of things. There should also be a public database for police use of force. Certainly at the federal level, that's something we don't have. And as I understand it, the state does keep some of that information, but it seems as though it's mostly numerical. I don't believe that it details demographic information about the individuals that have in fact succumbed to deadly force in custody by police. So that should be included. So it also leads me to believe that it's somewhat incomplete based on that information. And there should also be a means for independent investigations for both non-lethal and deadly force encounters. I won't make specific recommendations of exactly how this should go, just because I think it sort of depends on, I've heard in some places that the prosecutor's office feel like they should be the ones handling, in other places, other bodies, but there should be an independent review mechanism for sure. So that's something to consider. And then things I put in the category of accountability would be, if you all are recipients of 1033 surplus military equipment, you should stop doing that. Just plainly in that, I think that the use of that equipment, generally speaking, particularly in the use of a protest or potentially a drug raid, it really can send a message to escalate things. We know from the research we do on protests and the right to protest, that when officers dress for war, then that may cause them to act in a more aggressive fashion as well. In understanding that it may not be something that a program that could be ended easily, a relationship ended easily, I'd recommend that until you could stop receiving this equipment, that or ban the use, there be some sort of accountability through sort of public reporting. It was an idea that was proposed in a Senate amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, that if there's public reporting of abuse of this equipment, particularly during the use of protest, then that department may lose access to it, and they wouldn't be eligible for it should there be a second round. And then one of the other recommendations, certainly that my coalition partners are making, is that police not have a place in schools. So that's something else we can consider as far as interactions with our young folks. So I'll leave it there and open up to questions.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And Ryan, can we unshare the screen, please? Thank you. And so we'll take any questions anyone might have. I want to thank you, Ms. Roth, for being here, and Mr. Powers also for being here again. So we'll just do another quick round of questions, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards, and we'll thank everybody for being here. Well, let's start off with Miss Cristoriata, who had a question before we had to part, and then I'll go to Mr. Preston.
Yeah. So since we can ask questions to both parties now.
Right.
Okay.
I'm gonna ask them to be very succinct in their answers and not to say the same thing that the other person said.
Awesome. So I just wanted to go back to one of the recommendations that was highlighted before around never using profanity with citizens, and one just requested to hear more or receive more information about how that policy works, and just curious that if that policy actually comes with like what's the punishment spectrum for that? Where does it align when it comes to actually implementation?
Yeah, that when he implemented that policy, there was inter-department discipline, and it worked effectively well. I mean, it essentially cut out that kind of behavior completely. I mean, he was very clear that this was going to be the rule, and he had other policies like that. Whenever police officers made an arrest, if citizens came around after the police officer had it under control, and they asked him why was he or she making the arrest, that he made it mandatory that officers turn to the citizen and tell them why. He said, because if it's a public arrest and you're doing it to protect and serve the public, then just tell them. If you're arresting Chester, the child molester, and the citizens want to know why you're taking them into custody, tell them. He said, if you're arresting someone's child and they're juvenile and the parents are concerned and they come out, say, this is why, you can come, you can go down with us, we can have an officer bring you down so they feel like their child is safe. He said that an arrest for a legitimate reason, a legal and legitimate reason for public safety, shouldn't be in opposition to anything the community wants, because in most communities, people didn't want murderers, rapists, and robbers. They wanted their family to be protected. When it became antagonistic, it's when the police said, this is police business, not your business. And in reality, it is police business is exactly the people's business. And so he put that all into policies in the police force. Initially, the FOP pushed back, but eventually when they saw how it made police community relations actually better, then they all bought in. But he came up with those bold policies, put them in place, made them, put them along the disciplinary scale, and it worked very effectively. I think that can easily be done, and I don't think anybody would push back because he gave them the logic behind it. And I'm sorry, I Delegate, I think I went too long. I know you said brief, but you know me, so why do you even?
Thank you for that. I just, when you said it, it just sounded like the type of cultural change that we could see in the police department that would make such a huge difference. And also to Ms. Roth, am I saying your last name correctly? Thank you for the presentation. As a fellow advocate, I love the recommendations you outlined. I had a quick question. One thing that's always curious about the use of force in the continuum and how that's seen. Is there any discussion about drawing your weapon being on the actual use of force continuum? So I know there's different levels, I think, of like verbal cues. And so sometimes people talk about even drawing your weapon at some cases, like we saw when officers drew their weapon on the family and you saw the children crying on the ground and the trauma that conflict. So I'm just curious about how drawing your weapon actually factors into this use of force conversation. And has there been any thoughts for your organization around that?
I'm happy to start, but I'm going to hand it over to a friend who's a former law enforcement officer to finish for me. So I would say it's not something Amnesty has discreetly considered. In my experience, the way that police use of force statutory laws are written is generally it's much less detailed than police department policies are. And that's, I think, probably for ultimately good reasons, and that the law shouldn't try to account for every single circumstance that could occur. Without a doubt, while I'm not an expert on the use of force continuum, yes, like verbal communication counts as force to a degree. So, and there's certainly an escalation up from there. But I'd ask anyone who, perhaps Mr. Powers, if he has any thoughts about that specific element for others.
Yeah, I would. To me, it just seems logical that the drawing of a weapon would be either one step below deadly force or close to deadly force, because the options are very limited once you draw the weapon. Either you're gonna put it away and whatever threat you made about using a weapon, or you're gonna actually use the weapon. So on the force continuum that I made a part of the report that I think you all were privy to, you'll see that right below deadly force is impact techniques, and I think it would fit in that area. It's about as close as you can get to deadly force, because once you draw it, if he charges you, then even if he doesn't have a weapon, because you have a weapon out, and now you're going to argue that it was a threat to take him a weapon, then you're one step away from deadly force.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. Preston?
Thank you, Delegate Washington. And Ms. Roth, I appreciate the presentation very much. I just had a quick question about the statement about removing officers from schools. There's been a lot of discussion nationally, as well as here in Prince George's County, surrounding that issue. I mean, I am Deputy Chief of Police at a police department in Prince George's County, and I found that the relationship that we have is actually an extension of community policing. It's one in which the officers engage through counseling, de-escalation, a lot of the principles that we talk about through community policing. So I'm just curious to understand more about the issue and the recommendation. I know that Mr. O'Neill is the Director of School Security, who's also a part of this work group. And some of the numbers that have been reporting about number of arrests made in Prince George's County schools is actually, it conflates that it's made by school resource officers, when in fact it's really made by school security officers, which are not a part of the police department. And speaking to school administrators, teachers, and students within the city of Bowie, I found that most of them favor the relationship that the officers have actually in the schools and support them being there. So can you just speak to that a little bit so I can have a better understanding of that?
I sure can. And I'll also definitely underscore that, like, my expertise is on use of force, but I think that's just something to consider. And I know that's something that advocates in Maryland are pushing for, and the groups like Amnesty certainly stand behind as far as the federal recommendation that officers not be involved in schools. And while I don't disagree that there no doubt are interactions that are productive between officers and students, generally that recommendation comes from the idea that particularly students of color tend to be overrepresented in those that are punished at school by their teachers, and that may come with consequences that engage in the criminal penal system more readily because the officers themselves are there. I'm not saying every circumstance escalates to that in the same way that we recognize, like, most officers don't have the kinds of challenges that they would need to be decertified for, right? But that it's just not worth taking that chance as we think about the school to prison pipeline, where students who may be perceived differently by their instructors are punished to the degree that they now have a record because of something that could have been resolved in a different way. So that's the basis of that recommendation. I can definitely direct you to more people with more information and data about that, but that's my understanding and where we stand on this.
Hey, Mr. Preston, just let me hop in here real quick. We are also going to have a discussion on SROs and school resource officers on October 22nd, and we will have some professionals in the field that will be able to provide that and be able to answer your question as well.
Oh, appreciate that, Delegate. Thank you very much.
Yep, got it. Cool. Any other questions? I have one over here, Mr. Rodney, Councilman Rodney Streeter, if you're still here.
Thank you, Ms. Roth,
there we go.
being here today. wanted to go back to your other recommendations and just drill down a little bit on the create public database for police use of force. Was that meant to capture any time an officer has had to have been engaged in the use of force, justified or unjustified, or what did you mean by that exactly?
Totally fair. No, as far as the use of force being captured, you're talking about for the public database, right? It be incidents that are, as far as less lethal, I think is what you're referring to, in which case justification may not be relevant. But as far as a national misconduct database, when I say use of force, that's excessive force. It doesn't necessarily, by that I don't mean that like it goes through a court of law to be deemed excessive, but like if through department policy it's deemed excessive and there's a complaint against an officer, then to me that counts as excessive force that should be included on an officer's record. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because all it says is create a public database for police use of force. I just wanted to know what you meant by it. That's all.
Completely fine. Yeah, I didn't include a ton of details there, and that's my apologies.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Ivey.
Thank you. And thank you for the great presentations. I think they've been outstanding. I wanted to ask this question, and I don't know that it's a fair question, frankly, so I'll preempt, I'll preface it with that. But, the language with respect to use of force, and I do appreciate the differences that have been pointed out by you, Ms. Roth, and you, Dr. Powers. But part of what I think is going on is twofold. One is that police on the street got scared after crack hit and the semi-automatic handguns got out there. And so the shift to a warrior mindset and, what is it, better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6 and all of that stuff became a big part of that focus in changing the views about use of force. And the other big piece, and frankly, I saw this a lot when I was state's attorney, was sort of an implicit racial aspect to the decision about whether force is necessary or not. And again, I'm saying this is an unfair question. I can't figure out how to capture that in the standards that we're talking about, whether they're statutory or general orders or whatever. But it's clear that they play a central role in a lot of these decisions, split second or not. I mean, Minnesota was not a split second decision. Chauvin was not a split second decision. What kinds of things can we do to actually get at that? And we'll set training to the side, because I know that's, everybody starts there, and I agree it's important. But, after it's happened and we're judging it in one way or another, we're asking grand juries or prosecutors or juries to decide, what kinds of things can we do to really put our finger on that issue?
I think it's a very important one. I hope that I have a decent answer to it. I realize now, looking back at my presentation, that it was actually completely neutral on race, which for whatever reason I didn't include, but I usually do. I'm sure it's known to this audience, but there is a very clear overrepresentation of people of color, particularly Black men, who were shot and killed by police in accordance with the Washington Post database that was created, I think in 2015, maybe 2014. And that they persist in keeping that up today. That particular database only looks at police-involved shootings via gun, but there are other databases that look at other encounters. And across the board, they all show that. They specifically note that in 2019, Black people were over twice as likely to be killed by police as their counterparts by gun. And if you look at mapping police violence, you can look at the Maryland-specific data on that as well. That's, I think, quite stark. So you're absolutely right that it is a real problem, both in deadly force and less lethal. I've seen studies that suggest that as well. One recommendation that we've made to the way that the laws can be written is included in the use of force statute. There should also be a space that really gives the community the ability to help set guidance with sort of the attorney general or whoever the top lawyer of the locality is, who have been directly impacted, civil rights organizations, acknowledging that force should be used differently on someone that's experiencing a mental health crisis, someone who's pregnant, someone who doesn't speak English as their first language, someone who's under 20 years old, and people of color that just are more likely to be impacted by this violence. Now, that's not a perfect solution. That's a start of a conversation, but we do think it's important to the extent that community oversight only goes so far. And as we see too often, those community oversight boards don't actually have a lot of teeth. As Mr. Powers said, they don't often get all of the content that they really need to be able to make super informed decisions. So we think that that is a really important step. I do think to the extent that there's always calls for studies, I would say we already have enough. We already know that that's the case. We don't need to call for studies to do this. We already know that Black people are overrepresented in this violence. So don't waste your time on that. I don't think anti-bias training is the answer either. I'm just going to say, like, you don't ever need to worry that I'm going to lead with training because while I think it's not a bad thing, too often it alone doesn't lead to the sort of results that we need to see to keep people alive and to keep communities from being decimated. So we think that it does require more conversations, but there's no doubt much larger cultural conversations that I think are really starting now about this issue for people that haven't been paying attention, because another part of the issue, as I understand it, and one of the reasons that we care about really clarifying the use of force statutory standard is, should an officer be indicted for a use of force encounter and it go eventually to the trial phase, there has to be a point in which the jury is read the use of force standard. And one of the things that we have seen is the perception of police by people of color versus white people and how they are trusting the information they're receiving, whether or not they're more likely to side with the officer or not. And again, it's very case by case. I'm not trying to make any broad generalizations, but we have to, as a culture, understand that there are just certain facts about who tends to be impacted by this violence. And that should be part of people's understanding as they make decisions, informed decisions about looking at these cases as jurors as well. I don't have specific recommendations on how the jury instructions might change, but I do think that, to me, part of the cultural conversation really uplifting this disparity is an important step in that direction. But I certainly ask Mr. Powers or others if they have other thoughts.
Thank you. Mr. Ivy, do you have a follow-up to that, or you have any other questions for Mr. Powers?
Well, just to go down the rabbit hole a little bit further, I mean, to the extent the definitions are going to be objective and reasonable police officer, objective under the circumstances, and sometimes there's actually a subjectivity component that goes with that too. It feels like that when these officers use deadly force against Black males, that it's viewed as objectively reasonable. I'll just say it like that. And so trying to figure out a way to, and I don't know the answer to this. I don't know if there is an answer, but to get at that part, because some of these cases are about to go to trial that, you know, just popped up, they're going to run head first into that. And, you know, people are going to be upset when they get the not guilties, but they're coming because the jury instructions create that kind of dynamic, I think. And you're right, Ms. Roth, you know, if you've got a lot of people or the majority on a jury who that's their perception anyway, you're heading towards not guilty. So I don't want to be unfair, I'm hoping we can figure out a way to get to that problem.
The only thing I will add, and I will be extremely brief, is that in all the cases that I've been involved in and have testified, I think the benefit of having an expert explain what goes into objectively reasonable from the stand. And I know what the courts say, but no one have ever stopped me, not a judge, not anyone have ever objected to the fact that explaining what that means for a trained police officer as opposed to what that means from an individual who hasn't been trained, what that entails, the training, the experience, the things that you're taught in the academy, to make that term objectively reasonable means something more for someone who's gone through a training program. And that's what I've been asked to do from the stand in these particular cases, so that the jury, so when someone says that I was following this standard as to what was objectionably reasonable, I can come behind and say, but this is what that term is pregnant with. This is what's in that particular term. Then decide whether they were objectively reasonable, not just for them to say it, but it requires some explanation. And I think in many cases, that's why judges have allowed the expert testimony, because that term can be very subjective and very vague and used as a defense if it's not fully explained. And once you explain it to juries, then I think, because they don't get to ask questions, obviously. Juries don't get to ask questions until they not doing a trial anyway. But so I think that's been key in terms of my expert testimony, is walking through that terminology and kind of dissecting it for lay people who are on the jury.
Delegate Washington, this is one last thing, and I'll yield the floor. Ms. Danso said that the state's attorney's office has already begun implementing the multi-tier approach to approving no-knock warrants. The question that popped into my mind was, when did that start, and how many have they approved? That have been, and how many have been requested? So if we could make the request for that information, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, sure, absolutely. It's on record, so we'll ask for that information if we can get it. And Mr. Ivey, as the chair of that subcommittee that oversees all the use of force laws, so we're looking forward to a great recommendation from you and your subcommittee on use of force statutes. So
I'll send something on jury instructions, right?
Delegate, just real quick, just three quick things for Mr. Ivey here regarding his previous question. Number one, which is foundational, we have to begin reducing police encounters, mainly with Black people. And so what does that mean? What does that look like? It means public policy changes. And marijuana is a big one, believe it or not. We've got to end the prohibition of marijuana coast to coast. So federally, that's the MORE Act that needs to be supported. And then locally, like in the individual states across this country, we just have to end that, because when you look at the Department of Justice investigation in Baltimore City, it was those marijuana, smelling the odor of marijuana about someone's person that was key to these police encounters on the street, which then led to violations of civil rights and so on. It also means, do we need the police doing things like stopping vehicles for equipment violations? Why don't we just have an annual inspection program for our cars and so on? Other very trivial and small traffic violations. And there's a long list of things to reduce those encounters. Second is dealing with the Garner versus Graham decision, objectively reasonable. Like in California, they're still working on a significant piece of policy, and Chrissy, maybe you can talk to this a little bit more, about not just looking at the moment in time where the use of force occurred, but what about the minutes before that? Did the officer do what they were trained to do regarding de-escalation? Did they step in front of a car that was occupied and then ended up shooting into the car because they then say the person was about to run them down? We train you not to step in front of an occupied vehicle. So looking at what the officer did and did not do that was not in line with law or training and policy that led to the use of force. So were those actions or inactions objective and reasonable for a trained police officer? So we got to start looking at the moments before. And then third, we've got to address qualified immunity, right? Because when as a police officer, if I act outside of my training, if I act outside of policy, and if I act outside of law, I'm going to be held financially accountable, not the county, not the city. I'm going to be held accountable. So those are just three things that, and there's more, but those are three main things.
Thanks, and I hope we can get those over to us at some point too. I'm gonna ask Ms. Morning to ask her a quick question, And then Miss Pruitt, because I think she just hopped on, but maybe she's been here for a long time and I haven't seen her. But good to see you as always. Miss Morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Delegate Washington. And thank you, Ms. Ross, for your presentation. I have a question in reference to the military equipment, because that is one of the things that the community have been talking to me about, military equipment here in Prince George's County. And the community feel that we're at war and the community is the enemy because of all the equipment that we have, the military equipment that we have. Now, I have not seen the equipment, but how did y'all do a study that actually told you how much military equipment that we have, or other municipalities also equipped with this much military equipment? You know, do you find this all over the country, that all of this military equipment is sitting in one county as we have sitting in Prince George's County?
Well, Miss Moore, let me say this, because the county department has already said that they don't have any military equipment on them, and I'm just repeating what they said, that they don't have any military equipment. That does not exist, and so I just want to repeat what they have said. I'm just repeating what they said. That's what they said. That's exactly what they said, and so I'm just repeating what they said. I think all of us have heard that multiple times when you brought that up before.
I thought he said that they didn't have a lot of it.
Nah, they said the chief said they've done an inventory and they've gotten rid of all their stuff. Now I know that there's departments within our county, like some of our locals, that have it and has had it for a long time. But you know, we'll revisit that with the county, and we'll revisit that.
Thank you.
Let me let Ms. Roth try to answer that question succinctly, if she could.
Sure. Well, we don't have reporting specifically about Prince George's County, and it sounds like from what Delegate Washington said, there's not evidence to suggest that the county has it. That said, earlier, over just a 10-day period, Amnesty documented over, I think it was like 120 incidents of excessive use of force against protesters, and particularly, principally tear gas and some other things. Tear gas is not even a piece of equipment that's distributed through the 1033 program. It's just regularly available, but it's actually something that's not even allowed to be used in war. So naturally, we take some issue with that. I'll drop in the chat the report. It's got a lot of information. There's nothing specific about Prince George's County, but I think given the protests that we have seen ensue very much in response to deadly and excessive force used against specifically Black people, it's of great concern that a lot of departments around the country have sort of weapons of war that really cause a lot of intimidation to people whose intention is not to cause violence, but only exercise their First Amendment rights.
Thank you for that. Ms. Pruitt, last question.
Thank you.
Thanks. I've been here listening very intently. I know the work of all three of our wonderful speakers today. I wanted to kind of follow up on a question or a statement that Mr. Ivey made about objectively reasonable. And I guess I'm directing this towards you, Mr. Powers. I too feel that there is two different objectively reasonable standards. There's the standard for Black people, and then there's a standard for other people. And I'm just wondering how you can possibly tease that out, because I also, as a retired police officer, I also know that we were trained to make sure that police officers go home at the end of the day. The conversation surrounding our training did not involve everyone going home at the end of the day. It was a lot of focus on just the officer. You know, I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6 kind of, thinking. And I feel like that also is part of what becomes the psyche of objectively reasonable. And I just want to know what you think about that.
Well, I don't disagree with you. And this is why I think we said, I've said earlier, and certainly my partner Neil have said earlier, that I keep going back to this training. And I'm not saying that training is the default, because it is the default answer to everything, but what we never examine is the type of training and the type of leadership. So if you have leadership in the academy and that's their philosophy, that the objective is police officers to go home safely, because police officers, people don't join the police department to go home safely. They join the police department to protect and serve. Everybody wants to go home safely, but your objective, and this is what I say to the police unions all the time, when they come out with separate statements from what the police commissioner says, what the community says, it says nobody joins the FOP. They join the police department for whatever reason. They join the police department and then they become a part of the FOP. But the FOP does not supersede the objective and the mission of policing in and of itself, because they signed up for policing. So I think that is key. I think the accountability piece of those who are teaching in the academy, I think that's what you have to examine. I think a lot of times when we talk about training, and this goes to what Mr. Ivy said, when we talk about training, we don't know who's teaching the classes. I mean, if this task force could request or have that kind of information, who's doing the training, what's their background, what's being taught, what is a copy of the curriculum, of the lesson plans. Now, the Maryland Police Training and Correction Training Commission requires copies of the lesson plans. They need to know what's being taught. But I think if you do that, because I think that the type of training, not just training, who's teaching it, what they're teaching, and are they taking into consideration the socialization process to bring certain people to policing is important. And I think we never examine it. And like I said, again, if you look at some of these cases across the nation, if you look at the George Floyd case, who was the supervisor? We haven't even asked that question. Who was his direct supervisor? Who made him feel it was okay to do that and do that knowing that your supervisor may come back? These are the kind of concrete, pointed questions, I think, that could lead to reform, to change agencies. If other people, not just the person involved in the incident, but if other people knew that they were going to have to answer that question too, then for their own, whatever self-motivation, but their self-protection, they will begin to make sure that they teach objectionably reasonable the right way. They will begin to make sure that they monitor the people under them. Let's say, even if they don't do it because they have some ethical mission for the community, sometimes self-preservation is enough of a motivation to have a supervisor demand accountability and ethical work of the people under them. Because you're not going to appeal to the hearts of everyone, and certainly not everyone in policing. You know that as a former police officer. But there are things that you can put in place, that you can recommend in policy practices, and it has to be some kind of standard of who you choose, who teaches at the police academy. And we never ask those particular questions. Who's doing the instruction? If when you go to a college or university and you have a professor teaching you, one of the things that you get either in the syllabus or you can get on their website or you can get in class is an introduction of who's actually teaching you, because that's important. Not just the fact that you have a professor in front of you, but that they have some qualifications for doing that. And I think that will change some of the descriptions, some of the definitions, some of the actions that we get from officers when they leave the academy. The training is a default word, but the content and the substance of the training we seem never to explore.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was so on point and so on target, because we just hit the 7 o'clock mark. So thank you, Mr. Powers, for taking us there.
That's why I was on point, because it was
I want to thank, on behalf of myself and obviously the co-chair, we want to thank Ms. Roth, Mr. Franklin, and Mr. Powers for being here today, and obviously all of our work group members for your great questions today. Look forward to having more of these discussions in the next coming month with more presentations. Judge Lemassey, you have any closing comments?
This was great, so thought-provoking. Thank you very much, all of you.
Yeah, and we're going to take your recommendations to heart, and we will be considering them in our subcommittee. So you might be hearing back from us at some point. So please keep your phones or your Twitter app next to you, because we might be hitting you up. So thank you very much for all of you, and for those at home, be safe. And we'll be having another meeting just like this next week as well. So look forward to seeing everybody next week. Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.